Welcome back to Creative Tian channel. Today I will continue knitting the blanket we started last week. You can find the link at the end of the video or in the description box for the last video. You can see the progress I have so far. I used all 3 balls of yarns and I knit about 300 rows. It's bigger than a baby blanket because I'm knitting it for my 7 years old, and bigger is always better because they grow so fast. My exact count is 307 rows, and it's ended with 5 rows of plain knitting. So we are done with the main piece, and we are going to work on the borders today. There are many different methods of knitting a border. If you have a knitting machine with a ribber, such as Brother 260 or other standard gauge machine with a ribber, you can knit ribbing easily on those machines and just sew it up to the edges of this piece. Another popular way is to crochet a border. Then you don't have to limit to the size of the knitting machine. You can just sit down with a crochet hook and go around the border several times. That will keep the border relatively flat. Or if you want to do everything on LK 150, there are also many different choices. One easy way is to knit an I-cord edge, and I have a video about how to do that. I will link it in the description box. And one basic way of finishing the edge is to do the mark ribbing, and you can start knitting with mark ribbing. That just means starting cast on with every other stitch and knit enough rows and hand the beginning stitches to the machine and start knitting. And you can do the same at the end of the knitting. Move the stitches to every other stitch and knit enough row count, the same as the beginning, and fold it over and just sew it back to the main piece. I didn't start with mark ribbing because I wasn't sure what kind of edge I want. Now I'm going to go with simple stockinette edge. So I will knit a few rows of stockinette stitch and just fold it over. And then I will bind off or sew it back to the knitting. And we'll do the same with the beginning edge. We'll hand back all the stitches and repeat the same thing. So we will have 2 sides ready and only the left and right side left. And I think the easiest way is to knit the stockinette stitch panel and then fold it over and sew it back to the knitting. For the edge stitch, I want to use the smaller tension so it's not too wide or flare up, because the tuck stitch tend to be shorter and wider. So if I make it a little bit tighter on the edge, it should look better. My main tension is 9, so I will probably go down to 7 or 6. Before I start knitting the edge stitches, I want to add a contrasting color knitting together with the next row, so I know where is the beginning of the row. So when I fold it in later, I know which stitches to pick up and sew. So I have 2 strands of yarn right now, and I'm going to knit first row. And then I'll cut off the contrasting color yarn and place a clip. Now we can continue our edge stitches. And you can decide how many rows you want. I want at least 1.5 inches. So I need to double the row count of this amount. If this is 8 rows, I will need about 16 rows because we are going to fold over. I'm running out of the yarn, so I'm changing a new yarn ball and I wind it up into a cake. It's much easier to knit this way. And make sure all the weight are hanging in the right place. So let's move this up. And I'm going to knit 20 rows to make it a bigger border. So row counter back to 0, 0, 0. And just knit 20 rows. When I'm in the midway, about 10 rows now, I'm going to add 1 row of bigger tension. So it's like the folding line. And I think it will make the folding look nicer. And I want to increase the tension for this row. I'm going back to the 9 again and just need 1 row. And change the tension back. And I will need another 10 rows. You can see a line here, that's the folding line. So we have 10 rows above and 10 rows below. Next we can pick up the row here. We can pick up those stitches, hand back to the needles and just bind off. You can follow the column down so you can identify which stitch goes where. And it's normal to have half stitch off. So I do the sewing bind off. Just cut a piece of yarn that's at least 3 times of the width. And we use a needle to bind off. And we thread 2 stitch forward and 1 stitch back. So every needle is worked twice. So 2 stitch forward from the back to the front. And 1 stitch back, front to the back. That's the finished edge. This is the back side, or you can say this is the front side. And for the beginning edge, it's the same. You just hand it back to the needle and follow the same procedure. And we'll work on the side edges next time. Thank you so much for watching. See you next week.